Hi everyone. We are starting our last unit of the semester and looking at how social change happens. I would recommend to everyone to look at the midterm grade email that I sent out to you to make sure that you are on top of the grade that you want. I have graded all of the assignments that have been sent in to me. So if there is something that is incorrect, please let me know ASAP. So this week we are looking at how social change happens. So sociologists are very interested in how society evolves, especially how social structures and political structures change and are altered. So we will be looking at what is collective behavior, how does it turn into social movements, and then how does that enact social change? So collective behavior is simply kind of a way that sociologists categorize when people are engaging in activity with each other, specifically non-institutionalized activity, meaning that it hasn't been coordinated by some organization or some institution. They look at three kinds of collective behavior. First is crowds. So when a large number of people just gather together for whatever reason, generally they have a similar purpose. So this could be standing in line for a concert. This could be uh, walking along the beach front. So they have the purpose of enjoying their time on the beach. Um, but that is a crowd. Crowds can turn into, something more purposeful, something more organized. But often, generally, they are just non-institutionalized people who have similar reasons to be there, but were not directed there by a single organizations. A mass is a large group of people who are not in close proximity but share some kind of interest. So this might be, you can think about gamers or people who love Beyonce, right? So they are a following or people who have some kind of similar interest that are spread throughout either a society or even the entire world, and do not have to be in a single location at the same time. A public is a group or diffuse people that have similar values or ideas, and we can think of these as a religious public or a political party that are spread throughout a society with the similar ideas or values, but are not necessarily organized for a specific purpose at a given time, right? So if we think about all of the Republicans or all of the Democrats in the US right now, they are not the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is not currently trying to get them to all do a single action at this moment. So they are unorganized, but they do share similar values and ideas. So those are the three kinds of collective behavior that sociologists look at, and each of those have different consequences on society. So crowds, large number of groups in proximity, physical proximity, that generally have a similar purpose. A mass is a dispersed group of people with shared interests, and then a public is generally a dispersed group of people with similar values. Now, social movements, on the other hand, are organized groups specifically geared towards some kind of common goal. So they have been called to a location or called to the internet or called to some kind of activity at a certain time or place for the purpose of achieving a goal. Now, there are generally, and it's always more complicated than this, but the general stages of a social movement are preliminary, coalescence, institutional, and decline. The preliminary stage is when a group has generally seen a need for change, and it's kind of a competitive space where they are negotiating the kinds of changes they want, the kinds of messaging they will do, and the kinds of engagement they will do. So, are we going to do protests or are we going to do, calling our representatives? Is it going to be about this or is it going to be about this? Do we want this end goal or do we want this end goal? So the preliminary stage is largely when this is being debated, but generally the people involved recognize that there is a need for change. Coalescence stage is when they've decided upon a certain framing, a certain messaging, a certain end goal, and they are moving forward with that. This is when you start to see the protests, when you start to see a large number of calls or a large number of donations. This during this coalescence stage. The institutional stage is when the movement has gained some sort of legitimacy and they no longer need to, galvanize a large grassroots mobilization. They have some kind of stable organization with stable funding that can influence the political and social structure as it is. So these are things like think tanks are institutionalized. You have even Black Lives Matter to some extent is institutionalized because the organization hashtag Black Lives Matter has an organization, has a funding stream, has specific advocacy revenues or advocacy avenues. Equality Illinois is an institutionalized form of the gay rights movement. So these are when they no longer need to go out into the regular public and try to galvanize support, organize protests. Instead, they already have funding streams and avenues to meet with change makers like politicians. The decline stage is either when a social movement has reached its goal and it has, it's finished, it's done what it needs to do and it dies off, or it has possibly lost achieving its goal and there's no longer enough support for it and thus it dies away. So you might think it's hard off the top of your head to think of these because usually decline stages, movements decline for a reason, either that they're people like us are not involved in it or they have been specifically shut out. One great example of a social movement that met its decline is the temperance movement that sought to make all of the United States banning alcohol. That obviously has declined as most people and institutions realized it was impossible to stop people from drinking alcohol, and in fact, that actually caused more problems by banning alcohol. So, generally, in social movements, we have these four stages. Often, when you get to a coalescence or institutional stage, instead of moving into the decline stage, organizations or social movements will latch on to other movements. They will say, okay, for example, the Equality Illinois or the Human Rights Campaign for Gay Marriage or gay rights, when they achieved gay marriage, instead of declining, they now took on other causes for the LGBT community, whether that is workplace discrimination or potentially abortion or transgender rights, whatever that might be. They morph their end goals to stay relevant and continue moving society in a direction they would like to see. Now, there are a bunch of different types of organization or of social movements. The textbook offers 5, and we'll go through those 5 pretty quickly. So the first is a reform movement. This looks at a specific kind of thing that they want to change within an existing social political structure. So, for example, we have abolition or the suffrage movement, which wasn't seeking to destroy American society. Instead, it was seeking to end slavery or give women the right to vote. We also have the Dreamers movement here in the US, where it was trying to provide some kind of immigration right or citizenship rights to children of immigrants. But it wasn't trying to say we should destroy American politics. So these are examples of reform social movements, reforming a society, not destroying and replacing. Now, there are social movements that do try to either change almost every aspect of a political or social structure. And there are quite a few of these. The American Revolution was one where really wanted to change the political structure. Recently, you've had Arab Spring when there were a bunch of revolutions throughout the Arabic countries in the Middle East, like Egypt. Currently there's an insurgency in Myanmar as the military launched a coup and took over the government. Now there is a large grassroots insurgency right now seeking an overthrow of that military coup. In the 60s, there was a counterculture movement that was trying to change the culture of American society, wanted to push back against any, the was repeated engagement in wars that they were seeing since the 1940s, as well as a softening of anti-sex culture and things like that. Um, on the other side, during a similar time in the Chinese government and Chinese nation, there was the Maoist revolution that really sought to take over and turn China's government into a more focused communistic government. So we have the Maoist revolution there. But there are many, many examples of this throughout history, and they have not ended. They are still going on. Religious movements generally are looking at meaning seeking, but they try to provoke interchange or some kind of dedication to a religious organization. So you might remember learning about the Great Awakening in U.S. history during the late 1700s, early 1800s. Mormonism is a great example of this kind of religious movement. Within the mid 1900s to today, there's Zionism that seeks to establish a Jewish religious state in Israel. Protestantism, Martin Luther arguing that the Catholic Church had gone astray, tried to reform the Christian churches and developed a whole host of different religions that were seeking to alter how people thought about spiritual growth. And you also get into various cults like the Branch Davidians and David Koresh. Um, the one that drank the Kool-Aid is escaping my mind right now. In Guyana. But there's a variety of kinds of religious movements, some that are positive, some that end in great fatality or other problems, but otherwise these are religious movements that aren't necessarily trying to change a political system, but often are seeking to promote a specific religious organization or inner spiritual growth. Alternative movements are similar, but more aligned with non-religious or secular purposes. So a lot of diet fads, meditation movements, veganism is an example, fitness movements, like Beachbody, Orange Theory Fitness. All of these are some kind of movement that is seeking to inspire or promote self-improvement or changes to individual beliefs or behaviors. Resistance movements are the final type of social movements we'll cover, and these are movements that either try to prevent or undo changes to social political structures, like movements that we've seen from these other ones. So a lot of the movements you see here were based on changing or like undoing or stopping changes to political structures. So pro-life only started as a movement because of Roe v. Wade and abortion rights. The KKK developed out of a concern for the rights that Black Americans were gaining in the U.S. The Tea Party was a resistance movement out of Obama's election to the president. And a lot of conservative political parties are kinds of resistance movements. So Reagan, Trump both use the slogan, "Let's make America great again," with the idea that the current political and social situation has changed to be something they do not want, and they want to revert to something in the past. So the 5 types of social movements: reform, revolutionary, religious, alternative, and resistance. You don't really need to know the resource mobilization aspect of this. It's a large area of scholarship in sociology on how do social movements actually enact change in society, and they look at how they gain resources, like time, money, and skills, and create an entire industry or sector for social movements to thrive. But what I do think you should focus on, partly because it will come up in your investigating sociology assignment number 5, as well as the final exam, is framing. So framing is how individuals and groups identify and understand social events, how they explain and motivate people to be involved in that social movement. So there are 3 specific frames we'll look at. The first is diagnostic frames, in which an organization or group will define the problem. The prognostic frame, which will define the solution to the problem. And the motivational frame is what people need to do in order to achieve that solution. So it's kind of like a call to action. So to give examples of this, we're going to look at 3 different movements, frames on LGBT issues. So here we have conservative groups, the mainstream gay marriage movement, and progressive LGBTQ movements. Now, when you look at the diagnostic frames of these social movements over the last 20 years, conservative groups have had the diagnostic frame, remember this is defining the problem, that the problem is the decline of traditional marriage values, and this could be, specifically it's marriages between a man and a woman, but they often will also say this is the decline of society, this is related to a host of other problems, et cetera, et cetera. The mainstream gay marriage movement diagnose the problem as gay people don't have equal rights in society, and they need to be given those rights by giving them marriage. Progressive LGBTQ movements often thought marriage was the least of problems, particularly in progressive LGBT movements. You saw a focus on how poverty and racial exclusion for LGBT individuals was creating a greater risk of employment discrimination, physical violence, incarceration, etc. And so they wanted to highlight the problem as LGBT individuals being at a risk of discrimination and violence. So prognostic frames is what is the solution to this problem? And so, again, for conservative groups whose problem was there is a decline of traditional values, the solution was pass laws that define marriage as between a man and a woman so that only traditional marriage is acceptable and achievable in the US. The mainstream gay marriage movement wanted to do a constitutional amendment that opened the definition of marriage to any consenting adults. And because they weren't able to do that, they changed their solution to lawsuits that said that marriage restrictions were discriminatory, right? So they used politics or lawsuits in order to fix the problem that gay people don't have equal rights. For progressive LGBT movements, again, they would want legislation and awareness that protect gender identities and sexualities from violence and discrimination. Then we look at, okay, so what is the call to action? What is the motivational frame? How do each of these groups explain what needs to be done in order to get that solution? So for conservative groups, it was voting movements calls to vote for state and national policies that define marriage as between a man and a woman, movements to bring in conservative judges like the Federalist Society. And this was kind of the resistance movement to the mainstream gay marriage movement, which was, yes, we're also going to vote on state and national policies for gay marriage and try to bring in liberal judges. We see that in 2015 with the Supreme Court decision, the mainstream gay marriage movement won a temporary victory, that as we saw with the new Supreme Court's decision to vote to repeal Roe v. Wade, and Justice Thomas's suggestion that perhaps we need to revisit that ruling for gay marriage, that this is now again, we will see new problems, new solutions, and new call to actions by both conservative and mainstream gay marriage movements. During all of this, progressive LGBTQ movements have been pushing for various sexual freedom campaigns, awareness, protests, also lobbying their legislators to create policies that target discriminatory practices, and various underground support systems. So ballroom culture in New York, Chicago, and other places have been big at providing support locally for people who are victims of discrimination and violence. So again, we have the frames help people understand what the problem is, define a solution, or how are we going to solve this, and then get people to know how they can be involved. You see most politicians adopt a similar stepping stone. They will define the problems of their campaign, say what their solutions are, and tell people how they can get involved to make those changes happen. So to give you an example of framing, here are some news articles that talk about how defund the police was either a good or bad framing. So this is where framing can either get you in trouble or it can be very provocative so that you are in the social arena, people are talking about it. So we see that defund the police has become a really complex frame that if the idea was to get a conversation going, they won. If their idea was to actually get police reform, that's a mixed bag. I would say largely they didn't win on that. We see an increase of funding for the police, with the exception of various cities, and just largely not a lot has changed, and more protections have actually come out from for police officers, even with the democratically controlled national government right now. So some framing can be used specifically to stir up controversy in order to get recognition. But a lot of times social movements will try to, frame it so that you can gather a large coalition of people into your social movement and agree with your situation. So this is social movements. This is how people enact social change, get people to coalesce together, move towards a certain goal, and make change happen. If you have questions, please let me know. For your discussion posts, you will be describing a social movement you're aware of and posting about it and explaining what are the different kinds of framing that they use. As always, please let me know, and make sure to be looking ahead to see what you need to finish up for the end of the semester. And good luck. Thank you.